Are you looking for an exciting way to inspire the next generation? Well, don't miss the Black Creativity Career Showcase at the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry on Saturday, February 22nd from 9:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. You can meet Black artists, engineers, and scientists right here in Chicago and discover how their innovative work is shaping the future, and take it one step further and learn how to turn your passions into a career as well. This event is free with museum entry and it's perfect for all ages. For more info, visit msichicago.org. What's up, y'all? Steppenwolf Theater's revival of Fool for Love by Sam Shepard is extended by popular demand through March 23rd. The sexy and haunting play has garnered 4 stars from the Chicago Sun-Times and the Daily Herald, which said, "Now is the time to savor the current moment of Steppenwolf returning to Shepard." Fool for Love is on stage now through March 23rd. Get tickets today at steppenwolf.org. Today on CityCast Chicago, I'm going to shoot it straight. Civil rights are under attack. War seems ubiquitous, and for many things just kind of feel hopeless. But am I talking about now or 1967? Because that's when Studs Terkel, the legendary Chicagoan, published his first oral history, Division Street, America. To be clear, the answer is both. A new podcast is revisiting his work, and in reading it for the first time, I can say it feels like a lot of those interviews could have happened today. It's Thursday, February 20th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Joining us on CityCast Chicago are 2 members of the team behind Division Street Revisited, Mary Schmeek and Bill Healy. Mary, welcome to CityCast Chicago.
Oh, it's very fun to be here.
And Bill, welcome to the podcast.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Mary, I'm going to start with a very big question for our listeners. Who was Studs Terkel?
Thank you for asking, because as we've embarked on this project, I can't tell you how many people have asked that very question. So simultaneously, Studs was a Chicago legend. Mm-hmm. But as legends often go, many people don't know anymore who he was. Studs was many things. He had his own TV show for a while called Studs' Place. He was very well known as a radio announcer at WFMT. He had his own radio show at WFMT. And then in the mid-1960s, he got into the business that made him famous, which was as an oral historian. He had a big old tape recorder in the early days, and he would just go around interviewing so-called regular people about their lives and their fears and their hopes and politics, everything. And his first collection was called Division Street America, 71 interviews in that book. It was a big success, and so he went on to do a series of oral history collections after that, and that's really what made him famous.
Bill, just last year, you were a Studs Terkel awardee. When was the first time you remember hearing his name and learning of his influence?
The first time I heard of Studs Terkel was through my grandma, who used to listen to his radio show on WFMT. And yeah, he had this hour-long show where he would be interviewing musicians.
My guest this morning, in accordance with a good number of requests, is Frank Zappa. This was recorded back in 1970.
Celebrities.
Dorothy Parker is a writer of profound compassion and tenderness and understanding, as is evident from a great many of her short stories.
Famous people coming through town.
Of Lorraine Hansberry, whom we can rightfully describe as a distinguished young American playwright.
And I just paid attention and kind of gravitated towards him. And then later on learned about the oral histories and the books and all of that.
Division Street comes out in 1967. At this point, he'd been a lawyer, an actor, a radio producer, an author. His first book about jazz music comes out in the 50s. Mary, why was Division Street such a seminal work? Why is this arguably one of his biggest books?
Well, because it was the first time he had done this kind of oral history collection. And what people found in that style of reporting was a chance to encounter a lot of so-called ordinary, non-celebrated people just speaking their minds, speaking their hearts, speaking their truths. I do think that Studs and everybody was surprised that it was as popular as it was.
Yeah, I feel like we take that for granted now. So many of us have access to platforms where we can share our daily thoughts, our daily jokes. We can talk about serious issues, advocate for ourselves and our community. But the idea that someone was sitting down and just talking to everyday Chicagoans and archiving their stories, you know, that wasn't the norm at the time.
No, and these are people who never really had a chance to be heard.
Bill Studs had lived in Chicago for most of his life, and it's where he had the radio show. But what else about Chicago and Chicago during this period in particular made the people in the interviews that much more compelling?
I mean, the 1960s, like today, were a period when a lot of things were changing. There were a lot more white ethnic groups that were in Chicago and present and very visible. And I think the book reflects the demographics of the city back then. So Studs zoomed in on a Lithuanian American tavern owner as one of the people he talked to. He talked to a Native American elder who worked with the American Indian Center. And the people that he chose to profile and that we zoomed in on with our podcast reflect both the city at that time, and it's not necessarily how the city looks today.
And this was the heyday of the civil rights movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's talking to almost everybody about civil rights, you know, whether they're black or white. He wants to know how they feel about civil rights. It's also the Vietnam War going on. And so he talks to people about war and about the atom bomb, the automation of work, the civil rights movement. There was an urgency and a fearfulness that he honed in on with all of these interviews. And it so resonates with our moment right now. Many people have told us that listening to these stories from the 60s has actually given them some hope, because they can see that people were fearful in the 1960s for legitimate reasons, but that if you actually track these issues, civil rights, gay rights, you track them from the 60s until now, you will see that there has been progress. Imperiled progress, but progress.
When you all come to this idea of finding out where are people now, that's a big task in front of you. There were 71 interviews in the book. How do you start that process of trying to track people and their families and their descendants down, and then, you know, convince them to then, you know, contribute to this ongoing oral history?
One notable thing about Division Street, because it was Studs' first book, the people he interviewed, he gave pseudonyms. And so most of them are not in there under their original name.
Mm-hmm.
And in later books, he kind of went away with that, and people were proud to be a part of the books and, you know, wanted to be associated with Studs Terkel in these oral history interviews. But for this first one, people are not necessarily using their real names. And so the first step was to go to the Chicago History Museum and track down like the decoder for Studs' notes, and
which Melissa Harris did. Melissa is the person who dreamed up this idea, and Melissa did that.
And she did that like about 15 years ago when she first heard about Division Street, read it, became obsessed with it, and then set about finding some of the relatives. You knew Melissa from the Tribune, Mary?
Yeah, we had both been columnists there, yeah. A couple days before Christmas in 2021, Melissa invited me over to dinner. She didn't tell me why. She just said, I want to talk to you about something. She gives me a glass of wine, and she goes and she gets this book, Division Street, America by Studs Terkel. And she says, have you ever read this? And now I knew Studs personally, but I had never read Division Street.
Mm.
And she said, I have this idea. I've learned that Studs's original tapes of these interviews have been or are being digitized by the Library of Congress. So we could get the tapes and we could make a podcast.
Yeah, and then finding the people. I mean, it's a mixture with each person because this was in the 1960s, it's different for each person. So for the theater actor, there's old playbills and stuff that are in an archive at the Chicago Public Library. And
Oh, wow.
for others, it's looking through old phone books or census records, stuff like that. And then a lot of it is just Googling and using, there's just a ton of weird websites on the internet where when you Google people's names, you'll find phone numbers and addresses and old records.
Now is the time to get your tickets to Timeline Theater Company's Chicago premiere of Debate, Baldwin versus Buckley. Following critically acclaimed runs in both New York and London, this is a site-specific immersive show imagining the historic debate between author and civil rights leader James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. right around the event's 60th anniversary, no less. Presented in partnership with the American Vicarious and the Theater School at DePaul University, Debate, Baldwin versus Buckley depicts a clash that reveals the haunting legacy of racism in America. Giving it 3.5 stars, the Tribune calls it startlingly current, both of its moment and timeless. Debate, Baldwin versus Buckley is running now through March 2nd at the Cordell U Commons on DePaul's Lincoln Park campus. Visit timelinetheater.com for more info and tickets.
What sort of promises have you made to yourself this year? Maybe get in better shape or eat healthier, save more money, travel somewhere new. What about discovering a new culture by learning a new language? With Babbel, you can do that in just a few weeks. I'm CityCast CEO David Plotz, and I'm having such a good time learning Spanish on Babbel this year. I'm taking a trip to Mexico City in the spring, and Babbel is giving me the Spanish foundation that's going to make my trip so much better. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by more than 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or at whatever pace you choose. And because conversing is the key to really understanding each other in a new language, Babbel is designed using practical, real-world conversations. And one way they do that is with their own podcasts. I'm a podcast listener. I'm guessing since you're listening to this podcast, you are too. And I have been getting ready for my Mexico City trip by listening to Babbel's conversational podcasts. There's a short conversation you listen to, then an instructor talks you through what happened, and then you listen again, and then you catch everything when you listen that second time. There's also a great read-along transcript, too, which I love. The one I did today was with Maria and Carmela trying to make dinner plans, but Carmela is so busy. She's way too busy with work and yoga, but finally they agreed on brunch on Saturday. Studies from Yale, Michigan State, and other universities continue to prove that Babbel works. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. So let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting CityCast listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Let's jump into the podcast. In the first episode, Myra Alexander, never too old to be free, Turkle met her on a train to the 1963 March on Washington. And you say in the episode that when going through the book, you marked her name. You know, what stood out to you, Mary? Why was it important to start with Myra?
Because Myra was one of the most quotable, perhaps the most quotable person in the book. I mean, everything she said was just so pithy and original. Studs asked her at some point, what do you think Jesus Christ would do if he came back to earth?
He'd take a look and go on back to heaven, where he came from. He couldn't stay here. There's too much wickedness here.
And besides, I forget exactly her language, but he wasn't white like he's always depicted. Mm-hmm. He was a dark man.
So he would be a dark man, so he would be a condemned man.
I mean, she was just so poetic. I loved that about her. And then I love the fact that she was very nuanced. She was very bitter, and she knew she was bitter. She didn't want to be bitter. She didn't want the world after her to cause young people to be so divided, to be so harsh. She felt like the complete package to me.
But it was a bitterness that made sense. It was understood. It was, in many ways, it was righteous.
Yes. Yes.
And you see that reflected in a lot of young people now who still feel like their anger is righteous, it's deserved. It's the only correct way to be in this state of things, is to be bitter and to be angry.
One interesting thing to us, though, was we did find her great-grandson.
Mm-hmm.
Guy went to Lincoln Park High School here in Chicago, grew up in Bronzeville. He now lives in Denver, where he's a musician and a music teacher. He didn't know that much about her. He did not know she'd been such a civil rights activist.
Mm.
And when he found out, he said to us how much it meant to him to feel that connection between her and him. And he said, this was passed to me. It was very profound. I just felt when I met him that I had just met the reincarnation of Myra Alexander. It was just, he shared so much of her energy, her wit, her desire to make change.
In the second episode, you all follow the story of Bill Koza. What can you tell us about Bill, and what about that story really resonated with you all?
So Bill Koza was an actor. He was gay in a time when it was dangerous to be openly gay. He did a lot of work down at the Candlelight Dinner Playhouse, so we learned so much about dinner theater in Chicago. I'd known almost nothing. But in addition to kind of charting his life as a gay man through his times, we also learned about the change in the neighborhood that he came from. So we went down to the far South Side, which in the time when he was growing up there had been very immigrant, Polish, Italian, I think some Irish. And we went down there, and now it's entirely Black. And we had a wonderful interview with a woman who's lived there since the 1960s, a Black woman. And she just came out and she talked to us about how she had watched that whole shift from the white ethnic people who populated it through a time when it was mixed race until now an entirely Black neighborhood.
And I think by understanding this history, you also start to understand some of the physical geography of Chicago. The place where Bill Koza had his first communion is just this Catholic church that's seemingly shuttered 2 blocks from where he grew up. And we live with these ghosts, these buildings, these empty lots. If you've got no sense of history, you're kind of just see it as an empty lot.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are tuned in, you understand it on a whole other level.
Bill's grown up in the Chicago area. I didn't, but I came here in 1985. And I am still stunned by how much I didn't know and discovered by reporting these stories. I mean, I've been out and about in Chicago as a reporter, and I never knew that there's a long stretch of Halsted Street in Bridgeport that was once the Lithuanian downtown. So like Bill said, you know, there's all these ghosts in this city. And once you learn the history, it's like the ghosts become these vivid characters for you, and the whole place starts to make more sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that second episode with Bill Koza is my favorite personally. And I think a lot of people who worked on the show love that episode because it's full of these theater people who were his director, his castmates in shows, and well, they just know how to put on a show. They know how to entertain.
Yes.
And so there's songs and there's stories and there's just a lot of life.
We called a niece and nephew of Bill Koza, who are in their 70s now.
Wow.
Because we wondered if his family had ever found out that he was gay. And we found them, we called them, explained what we were doing, and they did not ever officially know that Bill Koza was gay.
Mm.
It had never been something that was discussed in the family. And I asked the nephew, I said, do you think your mother, who was Bill Koza's sister, how do you think your mother would have reacted if she'd found out? And he said, something like, I think she would have had a hard time with it in the beginning, but in the long run, she would be okay. And that phrase, in the long run, just like, yeah, this is about the long run from the past to the present. And there will be another long run from the present into whatever future we're going to. You know, sometimes it's good to step back, look at the long run.
It's a good segue because so much of this podcast feels like it's turning the page and in some ways revisiting a story from 1967. But if Studs Terkel were alive and well and starting this project in 2025, like the moment we find ourselves in civil rights under deep attack across the country, we are contemplating like imperialism and war at this moment in a way that is very similar to the 1960s. But how would this project be different if it were started now in 2025 Chicago?
For one thing, I love Studs. Look, like I'm his biggest fan, truly. But I don't think that today things necessarily need to be filtered through a white man who had a position of power. It feels like the work that we can do as journalists is to support people to tell their own stories and to do that as much as possible. And it feels like there's a place for observations and disinvested third-party observers to be making commentary. But certainly I think Studs was using his privilege as a white man to bring into the mix gay men, Black women, Native Americans, all these people who were not in positions of power in the 1960s. You know, and he should be credited for that. But I think if we were doing it today, you would just go about it very differently.
You know, I also think that if Studs were to continue to do what he did, that there would be a variety of people that he would be talking to that he didn't talk to back then because they didn't live in Chicago then. You know, he was really very good about seeking out the variety of people who did live in Chicago. But there were very few Latinos here, very few immigrants from Mexico. So you don't see them represented in the book. You don't see him talking to Arab Americans, to Muslims about being Muslim. So a lot of these things that are so vital and current to us in the culture now, those folks weren't here in Chicago in great numbers.
Why is Chicago still talking about Studs Terkel in 2025, a decade plus since his passing? And as we've mentioned multiple times, almost 60 years after this work was published. Why do you think awards are still named after him and that his name still resonates so much in this day and era?
You know, that's a really great question. Some of it, I think, is it Studs in his name. He's a brand name. So, for example, you know, with this podcast, I think without the name Studs Terkel attached, we would not have gotten as much attention as we've been able to get. So, you know, I sometimes laugh, you know, that there's kind of the Studs Terkel industrial complex. You know, there's a lot of people building on Studs's work, but it's building on it in a significant way. It's just like he just laid the groundwork. And because he himself was a character, if he had not been such an interesting, dynamic individual, we wouldn't be going back to him so much. But, you know.
Well, and I also think there's a sense that what he put forth, which is that everyday people in conversation about their lives offers value in a way to understand the world, in a way to understand the present moment, in a way to understand big historical events. That's just part of the water now. Like, that's how I approach my work. That's how a lot of people I know approach their work, is to focus less on people in power and more on the janitor who is sweeping the floors of City Hall. One of the people we profiled, her son is reflecting back on his mother's life, and he goes, she was right. She was right about civil rights. She was right about her work with unions. She was right. And I think Yeah, Studs was right about a lot of this, and especially his approach to telling these stories and listening, giving credence to what people are saying. And just why are we still talking about Studs? Because not him alone, but he was part of a wave that has changed the way we perceive the world.
Division Street Revisited is available wherever you get your podcast. I want to give a huge thank you to the team behind the podcast. Mary Schmeek. Mary, thank you for visiting CityCast Chicago.
It's been an honor to be here. It truly has.
And Bill Healy, thank you for stopping by.
You're welcome.
Before we get out of here, the first 5 episodes of Division Street Revisited are out now. There are 2 more episodes left that are coming out on Tuesdays. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, unless you only listen to our podcast at chicago.citycast.fm, which I appreciate you, because there you can sign up for our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago. You can check out our events calendar, check in on all of our recent articles, our best food and drink list. But if you want to listen to Division Street Revisited, you're going to have to go to one of the other podcast apps, just to be clear. Of course, we can't wrap without some good news. One of my main childhood libraries, Woodson Regional in Washington Heights on 95th and Ashland, is kicking off its 50th anniversary celebration today from noon to 6 p.m. This event marks the start of a year-long tribute to the history and legacy of the branch, named after historian Dr. Carter G. Woodson, for whom without we would not have Negro History Week, which he helped conceive right here in Chicago. It will go on to be Black History Month. The library is also home to the largest collection of historical Black photographs, manuscripts, and biographies in the Midwest. It's a part of the Vivian Harsh collection. Of course, Vivian Harsh was the first ever Chicago Public Library Black branch manager. I'm full of little facts and tidbits today. Make sure you come back to the podcast tomorrow. I'm going to have some more when we sit down with our friends Coralie J. and Mariah Rush to look back on some stories from the week. All right, I'm going to talk to you then. Peace.